Hi, Michael. It's good to see you today.
Yeah, good to see you as well, Karen.
We're getting together today because our plan is that we are going to be talking with Paul VanderKlay sometime in the near future, and we need to kind of solidify what topics we're going to be approaching in that conversation. And you sent me a list of topics which I'm interested in talking about, but before we started on that, I kind of wanted to spring one more topic on you that I've been giving some thought to. The other day I was listening to Paul's conversation, his analysis of the Peter Thiel conversation with Eric Metaxas.
hmm
And in that conversation, they were talking about vertical progress versus horizontal progress. And there just seems to me a lot of ways that that all lines up with things that you and I have talked about in the past, especially the technobabble issue and some conversations I've had with some other folks about globalism. It seemed to line a lot of ducks up in a row. So, but in order to get at the topic, I wanted to approach it from the standpoint of a quote that you sent me last week, because I just thought it was such a great springboard. You have an app that you use that brings you a quote every day. What's the name of that app again?
It's called 100 million books. It's actually more often. I think you can set how frequently it happens, but anytime I open a new browser tab in Chrome, it'll show me a quote from a book.
Wow, that's why
And
your
so,
mind is so sharp. You're always thinking.
well, it can be really distracting because like I'm like in the middle of doing some work and then like a quote pops. I'm like, I gotta read this, and it changes. So it's like you have this kind of incentive to interact with it right then because in the next 30 minutes or so it'll change. So if you don't like capture it, the next time you go to a tab, it'll be something different. Um, so it's yeah. Sometimes they kind of stop me in my tracks.
Yeah, and Paul's videos work that way too, where I'm on a certain trail, I'm working on something, and then I listen to his new video, and it's like, oh my gosh, now I'm on a different trail. But let's get back to this quote. So the quote is, and there are a lot of books here that I have not read, but these are book titles, and so I get the general idea of what he's saying. He chose the metamorphosis over the trial. He chose Bartleby over Moby Dick. He chose A Simple Heart over Bouvard and Pécuchet, and A Christmas Carol over A Tale of Two Cities. What a sad paradox, thought Amalfitano. Now even bookish pharmacists are afraid to take on the great, imperfect, torrential works, books that blaze paths into the unknown. They choose the perfect exercises of the great masters, or what amounts to the same thing. They want to watch the great masters spar, but they have no interest in real combat. When the great masters struggle against that something that terrifies us all, that something that cows us and spurs us on amid blood and mortal wounds and stench. I had three pictures when I read that. One picture is of the Harris-Peterson debate.
Interesting.
Yes, because that is like people wanted to watch that. They paid money to go to those big arenas to watch that because they're watching the great masters struggle against something. And I sort of got the picture that maybe Harris was trying to confine it down to this kind of sterile, bounded discussion, but Peterson wanted to take it out into the great arena.
He had a whole library of rhetorical tricks that he's used on a certain type of stage when he's talking against a certain type of let's call them like an evangelical Christian apologist. And so he wanted that to be the person he was talking to, so
Harris.
that those rhetorical tricks could be useful. And that's not at all who he was talking to. And so he wouldn't engage any higher order thinking. He
Yeah, so
wanted
it's
to, like
almost
you
like
said, bring it down to this
it's
kind of small.
almost like the difference between the boxing arena on the one side, which with the, what do they call those things around the outside of the boxing arena?
The
You know what I mean?
posts, the rings, the ropes.
The ropes, yeah. The boxing arena with the ropes. The ropes are his rhetorical tricks. He's trying to keep it confined to that space where we're going to watch the great masters do battle, but it's going to be within this confined space. At versus, like the forces of Mordor arrayed against Aragorn, where it's just mass, you know, chaos everywhere. But great courage and something arising from within that. So that's two of the pictures that I got. The third picture I got is this picture of when Peter Thiel was talking about the difference between vertical progress and horizontal progress. He described horizontal progress as basically one thing following after another, just in a progression of kind of imitation almost, which is what globalism has been. It's this, we had something and then we're just going to multiply it out across the whole planet and move on from country to country. But there's nothing new in that. It's just the same thing multiplying out. Versus vertical progress, which is always birthing new ideas. He didn't use the word birth, but that's the picture I get. It's always birthing, but it's always moving upward, and it's always something new. And so as I'm listening to them talk about this vertical and horizontal, I drew myself a picture. Now, where did I put it? Well, of course, I can't find it. But so you can think of vertical progress as you're always giving birth to, and this gets into the whole thing about boundaries, you're always giving birth to a bounded entity. Like God at the beginning of the universe, when he created, he was creating bounded entities. He was creating things that are named, things that have, that are contained so that they're differentiated. And so this vertical progress is that giving birth to bounded entities, boundaries within boundaries, sort of. And that made me think about this really amazing article that I found linked to in one of Paul's old videos on, it was written by George Gilder, and it's about, he's talking about the death of materialism, the death of materialistic superstition. He's saying that the theory of the quantum theory dissolves, has to eventually dissolve belief in determinism, deterministic materialism. And he makes the comment in there that knowledge is essentially anti-entropic. And I just thought that was so spectacular, because I've thought about that a lot over the last couple of years as I've explored this issue of entropy. That let's take, for example, if I'm going to clean my room, when it's all messy, is a place of kind of maximum information entropy, because there's a lot of information that would be required to put it back into order, because everything is spread out. It's the spread outness of things, the entropy of it. But as I put the room back into order, it's not really as though it's not really as though the entropy is, how does that work? So as I put the room back into order, I am gaining knowledge. not only is the room coming into order, but I'm gaining knowledge. Have you ever heard Jordan Peterson talk about ordering your room? That as you
Right.
order, you
Well,
actually learn things about yourself.
well, yeah, that it's an extension of who you are and that you're actually ordering who you are. Because to start to order your room, you have to answer the question of what is the room for, which really is specific to who you are and
Yeah.
what you're doing and what are your goals, what are your priorities. So like even though it's in a small degree, you have to start answering those questions for yourself to bring to bear an order on that room for yourself. And so yeah, and it's so yeah. What was the connection there with the entropy that you were
Well,
trying to make?
okay, so Gilder says that knowledge is anti-entropic. And he says where the way that the deterministic materialist used to look at things is that a physical system is always tending towards exhaustion and decline.
Mm-hmm.
But now we see that the world economy has clearly emerged as an intellectual system driven by knowledge. The key fact of knowledge is that it is anti-entropic. It accumulates and compounds as it is used. Technological and scientific enterprise, so it turns out in the age of the quantum, generates gains in new learning and ideas that dwarf the loss of resources and dissipation of energy. Which, what I take him to mean there is that as a new idea is birthed within technology, the new idea is so much more valuable than what had to be given up in order to birth it. So this is one of the reasons that technology always reduces in price as it expands in amazingness, right? So there's something there that knowledge, when entropy happens in the physical world, we are gaining knowledge in our conscious world.
Mm-hmm. See, I'm not sure if I agree with knowledge being anti-entropic. I mean, I think it can be, but it is knowledge is also introducing an entropy of its own into the equation. It's not. I guess it all depends on what you consider knowledge, but I guess I think it has a dynamic. As soon as knowledge comes into it definitely it helps you order. I can see what he means by like it helps you contain the entropy, but it also introduces new avenues of entropy that you didn't even know about before. So it's like this word entropy is so hard because it's like what do you mean by it, right? Like there's so many different ways to measure it. There's the measurement you could use of the individual consciousness's experience of entropy, which certainly knowledge helps to order that and lower it. But I don't know. It's certainly complicated with what because I like to think about knowledge as also is each little piece of knowledge you have is kind of like a little doorway into a universe of ideas you may never have the time to fully explore. And so it's kind of a portal, or it's an icon into God himself, even, right? Mm-hmm. To the degree in which that knowledge is actually representative of truth, it is an icon of God. So there's I don't know.
Well, so maybe if you limit the scope of what he means by knowledge to knowledge that actually is reflective of truth, then you have to see it as anti-entropic, because those portals of looking into God's glory it would not be a matter of waste and dissipation, but a matter of gathering together towards, you can see God's glory as this very ordered.
Right. Entropy doesn't map well onto like a good bad sort of divide, right? Because it's a measure of information, which there's all sorts of reasons, because we're finite creatures, we have to drop the informational level to, and Paul talked about this the other day, like you have to get it down low resolution enough so that it's small enough to work, that we can manipulate it within our working memory. So that from that perspective, that sort of anti-entropic knowledge is useful, but it's again, it's a representation of something larger, again, a portal into something that you don't fully understand, but you're kind of artificially compressing it so that you have a means to talk about it, to communicate about it, to think about it, to represent it conceptually. And one of the problems we have in our world today is that it's so easy for us to confuse those concepts for the thing itself. We forget what's happening, the storyification, the data compression that we're applying, and necessarily have to. It's like it's happening whether we want to do it or not, because ultimately we have to make choices. We have to live. We can't just sit around pondering all the things. We have to make choices. So that means oversimplifying to the point of a yes or no response to doing something, which is completely error prone. Like, it's one of the reasons why for me, like it doesn't make sense that we accomplish anything if there isn't some sort of error correction mechanism built into our consciousness at a deep level that enables us to recover from so many of the mistakes biologically necessarily we're making all the time.
So that error correction mechanism, do you see that sort of the same way as like when DNA replicates itself, when you say error correction mechanism? Or
I don't know the mechanism whereby it happens, but for me it's evidence that God has some active role, or his spirit has some active role in consciousness of all of us, that allows these oversimplifications of reality to actually function in meaningful ways, even though they are not. There is such poor representations of the whole. Because you think about it this way, like, so let's say reality is this, this infinity, right? And to try and interact with it, we have all these layers, biologically speaking, and then meta layers within our consciousness, right, that are doing all this data compression from the lower level, pulling it up to a higher level. And then what we think of as consciousness, what we actively, you and I can talk about right now, is this very top little tiny percentage of all the biology that went into that process, right? And so it's this winnowing down. But in that winnowing down process, it's just throwing data away left and right. And it has to. It has to kind of just make assumptions. I think I'm right about this. I think I'm right about this. I think I'm right about this. And throw away some of the underlying data that would allow you to see potential errors. Because otherwise I can't even get from the beginning of a sentence to the end. It's something simple as that. And so there's that process. And then there's the other process, the other side of it, which is now you're on the receiving end of this winnowing from my consciousness, right? And now you got to expand it back out into some larger, meaningful reality other than just the words, which are just tokens of something, right? And so there's so much potential for error in both sides of that, of what's happening within consciousness. And so I think it's from just an information processing point of view, it's miraculous that these conversations bear fruit at all in any dimension.
Well, the way you describe that, it sounds almost exactly like have you ever watched one of those films where they show the DNA unzipping, and then replicating itself, and then, you know, starting the new thread in
Yeah.
another place, and then zipping back up again.
But
That's
here's the thing about DNA though. DNA
with
is a
each other.
lossless the way it reproduces is lossless, right? It makes an exact copy of itself.
Yeah, yeah,
And one of the things that aids it in that exact copying is it's a double-stranded pair, and if there's this kind of nucleic acid on this side, there's always the complementary one on the other side. So you can't ever get too far off, because it won't bind together if these don't complement each other. So this is an exact mirror image of this at all times, and then it's twisted around together. So it's it it helps guarantee that you don't get errors in copying. You still do get errors, but it greatly reduces them. That double strandedness.
that creates all kinds of pictures. You know, we were talking earlier about the spiral around the axis being like us being wound around Christ, staying as close as possible to Christ as we can, so that when he communicates with us, we're getting maybe a little bit closer to getting the real communication. Well, let me explore this just a little bit further with you, because I think we're coming from the same place, and like you said, maybe the issue is with the meaning of the word knowledge. When I was thinking about knowledge, I was thinking about it the way that N.T. Wright talked about it in his article, Loving to Know, where he's talking, and it's very similar to the way that Ian McGilchrist talks about the way that the right brain gathers information from the environment. Is there is a loving, there's a way in which knowledge comes to us from a place of love, and that knowledge, that the purpose of the knowledge, words fail. I'm gonna have to go back and reread that article again, but the idea is that knowledge is a gift of love. It's a gift of the Creator's love to us. So I'm going to start back at the beginning of this idea as I was writing it out, because I'm trying to explore the idea of boundaries, the idea that God, in creating, he created bounded entities, and that if you think about, let's say, for example, and I might have my science wrong here, but let's say that light / energy gives rise to matter, gives rise to stars, which gives rise to chemical elements. There are dust and rocks and stuff of planets and moons and water, which eventually gives rise to, life. If you buy the idea that life arose out of the interaction of water and chemicals on Earth. Or you can look at it at another level of analysis and say that quantum particles give rise to atoms, give rise to molecules, give rise to cells, give rise to the whole tree of life that culminates in human beings. And you can keep going up the ladder from human beings to marriage, to families, to communities, to nation states, to civilizations, right? You can look at it another level of analysis and think about a seed, a seed which goes into the earth and dies, and then is born again into a plant which has all these branches, and then it has a teleology, right? So I once had an arborist come to our house, and we had a tree that had some problems, and he was explaining to me what he would do with this tree. And then he said, I was telling him that my husband gets kind of random with the chopper, sometimes goes out and starts cutting off branches that makes the tree not look very pretty. And he said, be sure to tell him, never cut off the crown of the tree.
Yeah.
And I said, why is that? And he said, well, in every tree, you know, every kind of tree grows a different shape naturally. It's the crown of the tree that tells the tree what shape to be. So if you cut the crown off, the branches begin to grow in very disordered ways so that the tree does not end up in its natural shape.
Interesting.
And I thought, wow, you know, I mean, because the scripture talks about we grow up into him who is the head, and from the head the body grows. And so I was thinking about how the tree starts as a seed, and then it grows, the seed dies in the ground, but then it comes to life again with water and all that, and it grows into a tree with branches and everything that's going on there. But it's the crown that's telling the tree what to do. So it's this looping thing again. It's growing from the seed, but it's getting instructions from the top of the hierarchy that's coming back down. And so in the same way, faith starts out as a seed. You know, the seed of faith is through Christ dying and being resurrected, and then that seed of faith begins to branch out and grow through believers, through the body of the church. And of course, the church can be looked at in many different levels of analysis. One level is just all the people in the church, which the Protestant church tends to look at it as that. The church is the body, all different parts of the body under the headship of Christ. But Jonathan Pageau was talking about the Orthodox Church being this beautiful system of truth that is displayed through art and architecture and their systematic symbolic rituals and icons and all of that is another representation of the church from that level of analysis. So a seed dies in darkness and is born again to a new life of differentiated cells. Each one has a purpose and an endpoint. And vertical progress also has to start with sacrifice. Vertical progress is rooted and grounded, has to have deep foundations. It's like vertical progress, right now we always say we're standing on the shoulders of giants. And that's because there is this deep foundation that goes way down. And then ideas are birthed upwards. And in my notes here, I said that vertical progress is allied with knowledge. Knowledge is anti-entropic. And here's the quote from Gilder again. Once seen as a physical system tending towards exhaustion and decline, the world economy has clearly emerged as an intellectual system driven by knowledge. The key fact of knowledge is that it is anti-entropic. It accumulates and compounds as it is used. Technological and scientific enterprise, so it turns out in the age of the quantum, generates gains in new learning and ideas that dwarf the loss of resources and dissipation of energy. So knowledge accumulates and compounds as it is used. So it's not like, in that sense, it's almost like money. That money, when it is spent, it actually it has an effect of compounding, because you're spending it on something, you're buying something, but the person who's getting it, maybe they're putting it in a bank somewhere or using it as capital to start a new business or whatever. So money is only dissipated when it's spent recklessly. well, maybe that's not the right word. I'm thinking of like, the third, fourth generation of a rich family. Usually they're all broke because somehow they've dissipated. They've allowed the money to just be squandered. But
I think knowledge can be dissipated too.
What makes the difference? Yeah.
Well, there's a crucial component for knowledge to compound, like you're talking about. There's an element of trust that needs to be instantiated in the knowledge for it to transmit and compound, right? And I think that's kind of been taken for granted. And there's so much that has been assumed underneath the hood that we haven't been watering the roots of the tree, so to speak. And so now, like, we have this great, crown of the, let's call it of the tree of knowledge, which was science. And we don't trust the results of it necessarily, or we don't, there's because knowledge can obscure. It can be noise as well, right? What is interesting, meaningful, salient to you can be noise, unvalued. It can be the exact opposite to somebody else. So there has to be something shared between the participants for this knowledge sharing to pass between us and to compound, so that it becomes something now you can build upon, and you can stand on the shoulders of the knowledge that I've created, right? If you don't trust me, if we don't trust each other, if there isn't some shared framework for validating the knowledge, then it can actually be counterproductive. I mean, yeah, I see, and feeds into that problem of technobabble, where there is an explosion of stuff, but all this stuff doesn't necessarily all integrate together very well. And sometimes it can be so much stuff that you reach this kind of tipping point where, in say a large organization, there's no single person that can now sit in a position of leadership and kind of understand the whole piece and make intelligent decisions any longer. They have to, I don't know, they have to over abstract and oversimplify, and they can get all sorts of feedback loops of bad information that aren't really in contact with the baseline reality of what they're trying to accomplish. So it's a complicated.
It's a function of too much information. I mean, that certainly seems to be like something that we're being varied by. There's so much information that everything has become too high resolution, so you can't grab any section of it.
There's a flattening of reality too, where you don't have the same hierarchy of trying to prioritize and understand, which information is more important to be put ahead of the line to be seen as more trustworthy, etc. And so there can be, and a lot of the institutions that we rely upon to kind of maintain the hierarchy and be the kind of trustworthy sources they've kind of abandoned that role, because of they've become overrun with political considerations rather than a concern with truth.
I like the picture that you're drawing of the tree of knowledge being like a hierarchy, and in the hierarchy, Jonathan Pageau is always saying that which is above loves and cares for that which is below, and that which is below submits to that which is above. So if that which is above is not loving and caring for that which is below, then that which is below is not going to be interested in submitting to that which is above. And that's this whole issue of trust. We can't trust the crown, the head of the scientific hierarchy, as having our best interests at heart anymore. Plus, I think that gets into what that Nima Arkani Hamed lecture about the morality of truth, when he was exploring the whole idea of why is it that science in the past always had this image of these beautiful crystalline truths that were so enriched with some sort of moral essence, and what is that about science that has that moral truth built into it? Because he can't believe in God, and yet he can't understand where this pinnacle comes from. And one of the pictures that he drew was of these two mountains. The first mountain was the pinnacle of Newton's law of gravity. And then the second mountain is a taller mountain, which is the pinnacle of Einstein's theory of relativity. And he said, the strange thing is that even though Newton's vision was incomplete, it was correct. And even though it was incomplete, it still works in the world in a very powerful way.
Yeah.
And the view from that mountaintop is just as beautiful and complex as the view from the mountaintop of the theory of relativity.
Well,
But
here's
the
an
theory of
interesting to
relativity
think
is
of.
more complete.
Here's an interesting thing to think about those two competing, words. Like, one is they're both, neither of them represent reality. Let's just put that out there, because that's one of they are stories, they're models, they're maps of reality that we can measure how good they are at allowing us to do certain things, right? Newton's theories don't go down to levels of the quantum bits and would never allow us to do, build a quantum computer, but it can do a lot of other stuff really well, exceptionally well. And maybe, in certain cases, it's actually, maybe it is still, we still teach people things based on Newton's physics. So in terms of like formulas related to gravity and so forth and so on, even though that doesn't get down to that level of quantum reality, it still is remarkably accurate and useful. But neither of them are actually pointing to reality. Like, they're elements of reality, but they aren't the reality itself. And that's one of the things that the modern perspective has lost. It confuses the scientific mode of conceptualizing. The models are confused with reality itself. And I had a further point for that, but I just lost my train of thought. But
Well, maybe it'll come back if I say, so if the problem with science right now is that it is functioning as the crown of the tree of knowledge, but it is not trustworthy. Perhaps it is not trustworthy because it is not reality itself, but only an element of reality. Therefore, it doesn't deserve to be at the top of the hierarchy. And maybe what deserves to be at the top of the hierarchy is reality itself.
okay, I just remember what I was going to say is, okay, so these are different models or maps of reality, right? And one of the interesting things is, right again, that we judge their usefulness by what they allow us to do. What kind of predictions they allow us to make, what kind of technology do they enable, what sort of understanding about the fundamental nature of things do they point us towards, et cetera. But that's all. It's a utilitarian approach. But one of the interesting things to think about these sort of pictures of reality, these sort of maps, is it's actually, a lot of times, it's not good to have your most basic fundamental structures of thinking about reality to be too over optimized to a certain set of data. Meaning, like, you could say, you know, the more specific you get to a certain set of data, the less likely that map is going to be generally useful across a lot of different domains. It doesn't matter what this is a problem you run into a lot in machine learning, where and this is why machine learning requires lots and lots and lots and lots and lots and lots of data. People don't realize how much data is required to get the outcomes that we perceive as being kind of magical, because that huge amount of data helps force the deep learning algorithms. It prevents them from over optimizing to one little narrow niche case of how something, you know, like maybe they're trying to find a picture of a cat. You know, if you don't get a really huge set of all the ways in which a cat might appear in a photo, you're going to have a cat detector that's very overly not optimized based on the data it's seeing. And so each of these models of reality are based on, you know, Newton didn't have access to the quantum levels. So he was working within the predictions within a certain layer of reality. And the quantum layers work operating on another layer. And they're dealing with different sets of data, and they're optimized for solving within those data sets. But, you know, when we talk about like kind of fundamental perspective, like how do you live your life? How do you make decisions? This is where a lot of it's actually a feature, not a bug, to have a kind of simplified conceptualization of reality that's been tested across a lot of different data sets versus one that's optimized to the year 2020.
That's a beautiful, beautiful explanation. Wow. That's Paul's JPEG, right?
Yeah, JPEG of Being.
That's a JPEG of Being, yeah. Yeah. Wow. That really, so on this old video I was watching, somebody had made the comment, the word is not the thing. The representation is not the thing. Most people confuse their map for the territory.
And we're encouraged to do so nowadays.
Yeah, yeah. Because the thing, no matter what the thing is, it doesn't matter what thing you're talking about, is so comprehensive and beyond our understanding that even the simplest thing that you can conceive of, like a quark, is still so comprehensive and beyond our understanding that we're not going to get there.
Yeah.
We're not going to ever understand fundamentally what it is. So there's always more than meets the eye. And like Paul was saying, we can either see the old woman or we can see the young woman, but we can never see the picture itself for what it is, because we're always shifting from one to the other, but we don't even know how to think about the whole thing.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, we always have to have a lens. And what's funny nowadays is, like, you know, because the scientific frame has become so magnified and glorified, it's almost considered irreligious to have any sort of skepticism or questioning or wonder or curiosity to try and kick the tires of a scientific statement. If you question it at all, you're considered to be anti-scientific. You're irreligious. You're going against the religion of the day. But that's actually how real scientists think. That's how they do scientists all the time. They always assume whatever it is wrong, and they try to topple it over. And one of the things we know is that we're so bad at seeing where we're wrong, but we're exceptionally good at poking holes in other people's stories. And that's how science progresses, because you can't see the hole in your story, but you get a bunch of people together and they're all competitive with each other, and I can poke holes in your story and we see that it's flawed. And what survives that intensive, you know, process of everybody trying to beat each other's ideas up over time, you get some that survive and have this gleam of science. But again, that sort of thing that we think of as science that is so cool and so spectacular in the results it's produced is a product of time. It's not something that happens just because the CDC or somebody from the scientific world makes a statement doesn't make it science. The scientific process is always one of skepticism and doubt and always thinking that the opposite of what might be being said is actually true and trying to find a way to prove it. And yet if you model those behaviors openly in public, you're like, oh, you're not, you're considered like irreligious because you're not bowing down to the institutions that represent science. It's very interesting.
I think that's part of what Peter Thiel is talking about when he says we've disintegrated into this horizontal view of progress. And that's not
Right.
just in the business world, that is also in the science world, and because of peer review and the distributed intellectual, whatever, that disc thing that Eric Weinstein is always talking about.
Yeah. So it's interesting because it's like the vertical progress almost always seems to come from the individual, from the outsider, from the person that's, it's Einstein, imagining light traveling or like flying along a beam of light while he's in a patent office, right? He's outside the mainstream. He's motivated by love of the thing, right? He doesn't have an agenda to win the Nobel Prize. He's just like somebody that's completely captured and fascinated with this stuff, so much so that he can't help but you know but think about it even at his day job. That's
That's
where these
that's that thread of interest that Jordan Peterson used to talk about, this thing that's shining out in front of you, this little glimmer. And in Paul's church message last week, which was so great, he talked about the resurrection of Jesus as the revelation of our future selves.
what's funny is I listened to that and I didn't hear him saying that as much as you said, but I found your
that was the name of the video.
oh I guess maybe I wasn't listening closely enough, but I found the way you called it out to be very interesting, of this idea of a future version of yourself communicating back to you.
Yeah, I had just watched the message on our church channel for our Sunday church. Our pastor's been doing this really interesting study on hope, and he's gone back through the ancients like Seneca and Epictetus and all those people, looking at how they looked at hope, which apparently hope was pretty much denigrated before St. Paul came along and wrote the New Testament, because it was seen as a very inferior motivation. So that was his first message. Then the second message this last week was on how to build hope into your life. And just really quick, what he said was, hope is the anticipation of good or the conviction that your life has meaning. It's a life filled with noble goals where you celebrate the victories and you learn from the failures. Now, I mean, I know that sounds like a bunch of stuff written on a motivational poster, but when he actually got down into where he's coming from on that was, here was one of the quotes: "You will never believe it in your bones until you live it out in your life. Hope pushes me, hope acts, and that's the way that hope grows." So it's when we focus on hope, and what is hope? It's the hope of glory. Hope is becoming more like Christ. That's our hope of glory. We look to the resurrected Christ, we desire to be more like him, and the ideal is always the judge, and so we're always looking to him fix my eyes on Jesus, the author and perfecter of my faith, who for the joy set before him endured the cross, scorning its shame, and sat down at the right hand of God the Father. If we fix our eyes on him, we become more like him. That's our hope. And that is changing us as we go. So it's the crown is loving, is reaching back and loving us up to him. Or it's like Jordan Peterson says, it's the future, it's your future calling you forward.
Mm-hmm.
Or it's like Paul says, the resurrected Christ becomes the revelation of my future self. And then when they started talking about vertical progress, I thought, well, yes, when your foundation is in Christ, you're always, when you're receiving knowledge from him through this kind of golden thread, or this the light that peeks through the hole in the map that you were talking about a few weeks ago. It builds this interest. So because each person is so individual, like Einstein was such an individual, when he saw that light gleaming through the map, it built into him this love and this passion and this interest in following that thing. That's where all invention comes from, is people who are willing to let that loving knowledge into their lives and be motivated by it, pushed by it, rising up to the hope of glory. Anyway, I also wanted to get at your thing on your list of things that we might want to talk to Paul about. And what I had picked out of the bunch as being of first importance was this paragraph by you. I'd like to give Paul the opportunity to reflect on the idea of what exactly it is that Jordan Peterson accomplished. It seems like Jordan Peterson colonized enough people's minds that he gave a very disparate group of people both the language and the impetus to have religious conversations about what it is that is most important. He demonstrated both logically and in an embodied sense that these ideas aren't just interesting or useful for philosophers, but that they are eminently practical and have inescapable consequences that are relevant for every single human life. And I thought maybe we could discuss that idea, because I think that's very, very pertinent, not only to the influence that Jordan Peterson had when he first came on the scene, but how that seed has grown over time to where we are today.
Yeah, it's interesting because, right, because like our conversation right now is a product of that, right?
Right.
And Paul's whole community and his project was, not that he wasn't engaging with the ideas before, but somehow this seed that he planted in all these people's mind said there's something here worth doing in terms of wrestling with these ideas and trying to understand them, and that there's actual real practical benefits for doing so, for trying your best to speak the truth, for trying your best to put yourself in conversation with the highest ideals that you can imagine. And I don't know, it's interesting because I think it can be just a fun sort of intellectual game of connect the dots and feeling, a sense of satisfaction in, oh yeah, this lines up, these pieces fit together here. But there's I don't know, and I think there's something about the specific way in which Jordan lectured and talked that helped kind of cut that off from happening, making sure that it always came back into some practical, putting one foot in front of the other, incremental improvement that I think is what's so important about what he did, and why it has the staying power in people's imagination, and why they so needed to talk to other people about this sort of space in their consciousness that now had such a place of importance, you know, and connected so many aspects of people's lives that were already salient to them, but brought them onto a single stage or arena where they felt like, okay, now um, I'm going to make an extra effort to live for these things, but also to find other people that can kind of help me mine out whatever else is here. It's like this gold mine that everybody's now in, just and they're like, it's like people are trying to figure out what to do with it exactly, you know. And I don't know, and like I don't know where this goes long term, but I feel like, you know, Paul likes to say that, you know, nothing changes without individuals, nothing lasts without institutions. So it's interesting to see, you know, what's going to happen with these communities that have formed, or people, these relationships that have formed as a result of all this. What might that be useful for in the future? um, I don't know.
Well, so one of the things that I've been trying to work out in my own head is this issue of internal coherence, which is something Jordan Peterson talks about all the time. Let's say, as at one level of analysis, you could say the internal coherence of a personality. Our personality is made up of all sorts of elements, and a personality is also a bounded entity. It has to have boundaries. If we don't have boundaries around our personality, then we're just open to dissolution. We're open to being damaged. So, you know, I don't know if you've ever read Henry Cloud's book Boundaries, but he talks a lot about what it means to be me and not somebody else. So there's some sort of a boundary around my personality. Of course,
Yeah.
there's a boundary around my body, my skin, and all that, but and everything has a boundary. A cell has a boundary, an atom has a boundary, everything has a boundary. And what is it that holds things together within those boundaries? What is it that holds a personality together? Then you get into this whole issue of agency, the difference between the internal locus of control and an external locus of control.
Mm-hmm.
And so you get into whether God's power is what is maintaining, not only created all the boundaries that make up the universe, but is also maintaining all those boundaries. Is there a sense in which a human being is at a different level, so that a human being has a choice between internal agency that maintains our own boundaries versus putting ourselves in a situation where we allow someone else to maintain our boundaries for us?
Oh.
And then that drove me down into thinking about this fundamental issue of freedom, the intersection between freedom and submission, freedom and obedience. So do you have any thoughts on that?
Well, the first thing when you were first talking about was that I had a feeling about was something of what Jordan Peterson's done is definitely connected to the body of Christ. When you were talking about all the things about how do things become united, how do they also be individual parts with their boundaries and relationships to another. There seems something, I don't know, something of what he's done that's preparatory in the body of Christ for sowing a sort of deeper appreciation for language of a religious nature, and for how might the body actually come into some sort of coherent relationship to itself. Um, and that's something of what I think of what's going on in these conversations is something of that's being worked out. And it's not like there's some sort of right. That's the other thing that is becoming more and more clear to me as well, is there doesn't seem like there's right answers. There's not like an easy fix for any of this,
Mm-hmm.
which is also the pattern you find in the New Testament. You know, if you look at any of Paul's letters, he was always dealing with a situation that was essentially a mess of one kind or another, and the mess was actually helping to bring forth out of him this structure to kind of weave back into some sort of order out of that mess. And I don't know, it seems like, and that makes me think about what you were just talking about, freedom and obedience. Like freedom is certainly a good thing. And the other thing that made me think of is orthodoxy. Like what is orthodox Christianity really mean? You know, and it feels like something of what Jordan was doing is kind of expanding this conception of people who could now see themselves as Christian. Even people who are atheists can suddenly say, "Oh, I'm a Christian atheist." And I don't really understand what's going on there, but that's something of what I feel like this preparatory work was this expansion, which creates a lot of more space for freedom than we may have imagined was there. And now it's like, now what sort of structure and orthodoxy fits into that space? I don't really know the answer, but I think that's what's happening, right?
Well,
And I think
let
it's
me throw
interesting
out,
that a lot of people are getting voices that didn't have voices, like Eastern Orthodox voices, and um, I put in, like Sam, the Unitarian from Paul's community, like there's something in these outside voices that have been overlooked that is a legitimate part of the body functioning together. And like it's like things are coming to awake that I'm a part of something larger is what I see happening.
mhm. Yeah, I think that has to do with the center and the margins and the fuzzy, that boundaries, all boundaries need some sort of fuzzy edge, some sort of space on some part of the boundary needs to be fuzzy edges so that it can connect up with other things, because all these things that have boundaries are also part of a larger thing. The cells are all part of an organ, which is part of a body, which is part of so everything. And so there have to be these fuzzy edges.
Yeah.
Here's when you're talking about this whole idea of just a second ago you said the expansion creates more space for freedom. And what is that going to look like? And so there's this old Flannery O'Connor quote that I really like. Art transcends its limitations only by staying within them. Which to me is kind of a microcosm of the whole idea of boundaries, that when you are inside your when you're inside constraints, you actually transcend. That's where the true creativity really comes from, so that you're able to transcend the boundaries that you're within. So it's something like that when I submit to Christ, that is my ultimate freedom.
Yeah. Well, submit to Christ and submit to one another as well.
Yes.
There's something in my essence that now becomes magnified by its connection to the larger body.
Yes.
But can only happen in sort of that recognition of certain limitations. And as you were just pointing out, that recognition of the limitations actually creates the space for freedom, right? Because now you have the opportunity to go deep into your sort of reason for being, which we all need, you know.
See, and that's where all these multi-dimensional things come in. When you said we have the opportunity to go deep, there's so many directions that a person can go that we run out of dimensions in our physical world. Because when you say go deep, you can go deep into your spiritual connections, but you can also go deep into your intellectual dimensions, and you can go deep into your philosophical dimensions, and you can go deep into your emotional dimensions, you can go deep into your relational dimensions. There's too many directions to go to survive in a three-dimensional world. Right? Every aspect of reality seems to be like that. Once you start looking at a thing and then looking at how many different dimensional aspects that thing has, all of a sudden you're in a world of multiple dimensions, which is neither here nor there, but it just made my brain explode. So what I said before was that when we submit to Christ, that's when our freedom expands. And then you said submitting to others is also a part of that. So we're submitted to Christ, we're submitted to others, and the intersection of those two places is the cross. Wow. There's so much depth and riches in God's truth. Just can't get to the end of it.
That's for sure.
Well, does that seem like it would be a good thing to talk to Paul about?
Yeah, I'm genuinely interested in his reflections on this because I know it's something that deeply fascinates him as well. But yeah, definitely.
Maybe by the time we have the conversation with him, we will know more, because I noticed that in Jordan Peterson's latest newsletter, the comment is in there that he's going to be giving everybody an update very soon.
I hope so.
Yeah. So
I hope he's doing well. That reminds me, I should pray for him more often.
Yeah, I often forget to pray for him as well. There's so many things to be praying for these days.
That's always the truth, right?
Yeah, it can get overwhelming. Are you and yours, everybody doing well in the midst of the Corona world?
Yeah. All things
Did
considered,
Georgia
for
loosen
sure.
up some of their restrictions?
They did, but it doesn't. Most people, at least here in the city limits of Atlanta, aren't really. They're still being fairly cautious. So.
Yeah, our neighborhood got 6 more weeks of, or 4 more weeks of, 5 more weeks of shelter in place orders. So.
Yeah, we just had an all hands meeting at my company, which is in Santa Clara, and they said as much.
Yep. And you know, 3 weeks ago I would have said, it's okay, I can handle it. As the time goes on, though, it gets more and more, oh, really? But I still believe there's something really major going on in the midst of all this, because there's this thing about boundaries. Boundaries are a very, very important element of reality. And we had become a world with almost no boundaries, and all of a sudden this thing happened, and now there are boundaries everywhere. So some sort of a major shift or learning potential or something is happening right now. we're going through some kind of a funnel, or this narrow part of the hourglass coming down, filtering through, and going to spin out into something else. I don't know what that's going to be.
Yeah, I don't. Wouldn't even want to speculate.
Yeah,
I remember having this premonition. I don't know when this was, but I remember just having this premonition that 2020 was going to be a very interesting year. Wasn't thinking it along these dimensions at all. But I don't know. It's I mean, it's interesting for me personally, but I just think there's just so much going down right now. It's
well, it makes me think back to what you said about it's not good to have your basic models be too over optimized to a certain set of data. And I think that's definitely part of what is maybe misleading our governmental authorities in a lot of countries, is that the basic models that they're using are too over optimized to a certain set of data. And
yeah.
So rather than being flexibly prepared for the metagame, the rules of the metagame, we're stuck on the rules of one particular game, hoping that that's the rule set that should work. But there's this guy named Jason that I did a conversation with a while back, who's from Australia. And he was saying that he was thankful that there are so many different countries that are dealing with this, because in a perfect world, what would happen is that you have 180 experiments going on, 180 countries, each doing things their own way. Then you could look at all these different data sets and ways of handling it, and you could see which ones are the most effective.
Except I don't think that's what happened. I think most
That's
people
not what
copy
happened.
pasted.
Yeah, that's not what
Copy
happened
paste.
at all. Yeah, but that would have been the right move.
And for political leaders, it's an easy, CYA, because I did what the prevailing wisdom said to do,
Yeah,
so
yeah.
I can't be blamed.
Yeah, and I can empathize with the political leaders. Who wants to be the one who's in charge when all these deaths go down, So it seems like they're not going to let loose of the reins, because the minute they let loose of the reins, the numbers of deaths are going to go up, and that guy is still in charge, and it's going to make him look bad. So if he can keep it clamped down. So yeah, I can't speculate either on what's going to happen, but these are interesting times. Well, this has been great, Michael. I will put some notes together and maybe send Paul this video.
Sure.
What he thinks, and is it okay if I publish it?
Yeah. Definitely.
Okay. Well, you have a great day.
You too, Karen. Talk to you soon. Bye.